The station smelled like every other coalition facility Velara-san had ever set foot in: recycled oxygen, with a faint undertone of burnt circuitry, and something the humans inexplicably called fresh linen in their atmospheric processors, as though a room full of diplomats and security advisors might be fooled into thinking they were somewhere pleasant. They were not somewhere pleasant. They were on Meridian Junction, a mid-rim station that existed primarily to host meetings that no one particularly wanted to attend, about topics no one particularly wanted to discuss, served with coffee that no one with functioning taste receptors should have been willing to drink. Velara had functioning taste receptors. She had declined the coffee. She had been to 41 coalition briefings in 12 years of diplomatic work. She knew the rhythm of them the way she knew her own pulse: the shuffling of chairs, the low hum of translation earpieces cycling through their frequency checks, the particular silence that fell when someone senior entered a room, and everyone briefly pretended to be more interested in their data slates than they actually were. She was good at this. She was, by most measurable accounts, exceptionally good at this. The Erethian Collective had not sent her across 4-star systems to a station that smelled of linen and broken promises because she was anything less than composed. She was composed. She was walking through the briefing room door with the measured confidence of someone who had negotiated trade corridors, mediated border disputes, and once talked 3 separate factions out of open conflict over fishing rights in a shared asteroid belt. A memory she found quietly absurd every time it surfaced. She was setting her leather-bound data folio on the table, nodding to the Cashin delegate on her left, noting the empty chair where the Velurian representative would eventually materialize 20 minutes late, as they always did, scanning the room with the unhurried professional thoroughness of someone who had learned to read a room before the room had a chance to read her. And then she stopped, not slowed, not paused, stopped the way a ship stops when it drops out of faster-than-light travel, the way sound stops in the second before an alarm resolves itself into meaning. Her secondary eyelids, the translucent inner lids that her species deployed involuntarily in moments of sensory overload, slid halfway across her eyes before she caught herself and willed them back. The bioluminescent patterns that ran along her collarbones and the outer lines of her jaw, patterns she had spent years learning to regulate, patterns that functioned for her people the way a blush or a flinch functioned for a human, flared briefly gold, before she shut them down with the practiced discipline of someone who had given a great many speeches in rooms where broadcasting her emotional state would have been catastrophic. He was sitting in the back row. He was sitting in the back row taking notes on a battered physical notepad, with a stylus that appeared to be held together with what she could only assume was determination and old adhesive, and he was wearing the slightly rumpled dress uniform of a mid-level human military advisor. And he was older, of course he was older. 12 years was 12 years regardless of the species doing the aging. But it was him. It was absolutely, with the full certainty of a memory she had examined from every possible angle over more than a decade, him. Velara-san stood in the middle of a coalition security briefing and felt the room dissolve. Not literally. She was aware, in the part of her mind that was still running its professional subroutines like a loyal and increasingly alarmed background program, that the room was entirely intact. The chairs were still chairs. The Cashin delegate was still watching her with the mildly curious expression of someone wondering why the Erethian attaché had stopped walking. The atmospheric processors were still producing their fraudulent linen scent. None of this had changed. What had changed was that for 12 years she had operated on the quietly settled assumption that the human soldier who had pulled her from the burning wreckage of Tarsus Station was, in all reasonable probability, dead. She had searched. She had searched with the thorough, methodical desperation of someone who needed to know and kept finding walls, military records sealed, personnel files restricted, a face she could reconstruct perfectly from memory but could never match to a name. She had eventually, with the particular grief of someone closing a door they'd hoped to leave open, accepted it. And he was sitting 20 meters away, holding a stylus together with willpower, and he was alive. The Kashin delegate leaned slightly toward her. "Attaché-san, you've stopped." "I'm aware," she said. Her voice came out entirely level. She was profoundly grateful for that. "Is something wrong?" Velara looked at the back of the human advisor's head. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was still writing, unhurried, present, alive in the specific and unremarkable way that people were alive when they had no idea that someone 20 meters away had just had the architectural foundations of 12 years quietly detonated beneath them. "No," she said, "I simply remembered something." She had been 26 years old when Tarsus Station burned. That was the first thing she always remembered, not the fire itself, not the sound of the hull integrity warnings cycling through their final futile announcements, but the specific, almost insulting ordinariness of what she had been doing in the 3 minutes before everything collapsed. She had been filing a diplomatic transit form. Form 7 Theta, Intercoalition Personnel Movement, required in triplicate, notoriously resistant to the autofill function on every data terminal in the known galaxy, regardless of what the technical documentation promised. She had been on her 4th attempt to get the system to accept her credentials when the first explosion moved through the station like a thought through a mind, not loud at first, but total, present in everything simultaneously. She remembered thinking, with the particular clarity that arrives in the seconds before the body understands it is in danger, that she had not saved her work. The form was gone, obviously. The terminal was gone. Most of that section of Tarsus was gone within the following 4 minutes, and Velara had spent those 4 minutes learning things about herself that no amount of diplomatic training had prepared her for, primarily that she was, when faced with a collapsing corridor and a wall of superheated gas rolling toward her from the docking sector, not as calm as she had always privately assumed she would be. She was fast, which surprised her. She was also, she would later admit only to herself, making sounds that she was reasonably certain her diplomatic credentials could not survive if anyone recorded them. The corridor had given way on her left. She had gone right, and right had turned out to be a dead end with a buckled emergency door that had decided, in the grand tradition of emergency infrastructure everywhere, that this was an excellent moment to malfunction. She had hit it twice with her shoulder, then a third time. The door had remained entirely indifferent to her situation. That was when she had heard him, not words at first. Just boots, the particular rhythm of someone running who knew where they were going, which was a sound entirely distinct from the running of someone who did not. And Velara had been producing the second kind for the better part of 2 minutes. She had turned, and through the smoke, through the orange emergency lighting that turned everything the color of a dying star, there had been a human soldier moving toward the buckled door with the focused, unhurried purpose of someone who had done this before. He had not looked at her first. He had looked at the door, assessed it in approximately 1 second, and then hit it in exactly the right place with exactly the right angle of force, and it had opened. Then he had looked at her, and she had seen his face for the first and until 40 minutes ago last time. She remembered the face. She had always remembered it, the particular set of his jaw, the way the emergency lighting had caught the smoke grid on his skin, the expression he wore, which was not heroic in any way she had been taught to recognize heroism. He had looked, if she was honest, mildly inconvenienced, as though saving a stranded Erethian diplomat from a collapsing station was a reasonable but somewhat inefficient addition to an already complicated evening. There was something she had always found quietly extraordinary about that expression. It had no performance in it. He had not been brave at her. He had simply been solving the immediate problem, and she happened to be part of it. He had moved her through the corridor with one hand on her arm, not rough but absolute, the grip of someone communicating direction rather than force. Twice, the ceiling had shifted, and he had put himself between her and it without discussion, without any visible calculation, just a body choosing a position and staying there. She had understood, even in the chaos, that she was watching a habit rather than a decision, something trained so deeply into him that it operated beneath the level of thought. She found she could not decide. In all the years she had turned this memory over, whether that made it more remarkable or less. She had eventually concluded it made it both. He had handed her to the medical team at the evacuation bay with 4 words, "She's cleared, secondary corridor," and then he had turned back into the smoke before she had formed a single sentence. She had not even asked his name. The briefing had been running for 20 minutes now. Someone from the Terran Defense Advisory was presenting updated threat assessment models for the outer coalition borders, and the holographic display above the table was cycling through probability matrices with the hypnotic rhythm of something that expected to be believed. Velara was taking notes. Her notes were, she was almost certain, coherent. She was a professional. She had sat through briefings while managing far more demanding internal conditions than this. She had once negotiated a 40-minute trade extension while quietly experiencing what her physician later confirmed was a moderate allergic reaction to something in a Kashan ceremonial tea, and she had not let that show either. But her eyes kept moving to the back row. He was still writing on his notepad. He had, at some point, apparently resolved whatever structural crisis had been threatening his stylus, because he was using it with renewed confidence. He had not looked up. He had no reason to look up. He was a military advisor at a routine coalition briefing, and nothing in that room was asking him to look up, and he had absolutely no way of knowing that the Erethian diplomat sitting 4 rows ahead of him had been carrying his face in her memory for 12 years like a pressed flower in a book she kept returning to without entirely meaning to. Velara looked back at the probability matrices. She thought, I have to say something. She thought immediately after, I absolutely cannot say something. She thought after that, he is going to leave this room at the end of this briefing and walk back into the galaxy, and I will lose him again, and this time I will have no excuse. The holographic display cycled to a new threat model. The Valurian representative, who had arrived 18 minutes late and was now loudly unwrapping something that smelled of fermented grain, leaned over and whispered to his aide. Velara's secondary eyelids flickered once. Her jaw patterns, the bioluminescent lines she had worked so hard to discipline, pulsed a single quiet gold in the recycled station air. She picked up her stylus. She put it down. 12 years, she thought, was a very long time to have a conversation with someone who did not know you were having it. The briefing ended at the 14th hour, station time, with the particular collective exhale of a room full of people who had been pretending to find probability matrices fascinating for 2.5 hours. Chairs shifted. Data slates were closed with the quiet relief of things that had been held too long. The Valurian representative had fallen asleep somewhere in the final 40 minutes, and woke now with a start that sent his fermented grain snack skidding across the table toward the Kashan delegate, who caught it with the long-practiced reflex of someone who had attended many of these briefings and had learned that the Valurians were always a variable. Velara did not move. She watched him begin to gather his things from the back row, the notepad, the structurally compromised stylus, a data slate that had seen considerably better days, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had no reason to be anywhere urgently. He was talking to the person beside him, something low and brief, and then he was standing, and he was going to walk out of the room, and Velara San, who had once talked 3 armed factions down from open conflict over asteroid fishing rights, stood up. Her legs worked. That was something. She moved through the dispersing crowd with what she hoped was the appearance of someone who had a specific and professional destination, and not the appearance of someone whose entire internal architecture was vibrating at a frequency she did not have a diplomatic term for. She reached the back of the room as he was pulling on his jacket, a civilian jacket over the uniform, slightly too large, the jacket of someone who had stopped caring about the jacket some time ago, and she said, with the full composed weight of 12 years of training behind her. "Excuse me." He turned. She had prepared for this moment in the abstract approximately 10,000 times. She had not, in any of those preparations, adequately prepared for the specific experience of watching recognition fail to happen in real time. He looked at her with the polite and entirely empty attention of someone encountering a stranger, and something in Velara's chest did a thing she chose not to examine closely. "Attaché," he said, reading her coalition ID badge with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned to do that quickly at events like this. He had warm eyes. She had remembered that correctly. "Can I help you with something?" "You don't know who I am," she said. It came out more directly than she had intended. He blinked. "I know," he said, with the careful honesty of someone deciding that pretending was not worth either of their time. "I'm sorry I don't." "Should I?" Velara considered, briefly, the full range of responses available to her. She was a diplomat. She had options. She could be graceful about this. She could construct an approach that preserved the dignity of both parties and introduce the relevant history at a pace that did not immediately make this man feel terrible about the state of his memory. "Tarsus Station," she said, 12 years ago. She watched it move through him. Not recognition, exactly, not the sudden clarity she had perhaps imagined in some version of this moment. What moved through him was older and less clean than recognition. His expression did something complicated, and then he was very still in the way that people were still when something they had put somewhere carefully was being moved without their permission. "I was there," he said slowly. "You pulled me out of a collapsed corridor in the secondary residential sector. You got the emergency door open. You put yourself between me and two ceiling failures in the evacuation passage." She kept her voice even. "You handed me to the medical team and walked back into the fire. I never learned your name." He stared at her. Around them the room was emptying with cheerful indifference, the Valurian representative loudly demanding to know who had taken his snack, the Cashan delegate pretending not to hear him. None of them were having the conversation happening in the back row. "There were a lot of people at Tarsus," he said finally. It was not a dismissal. It was, she realized, a kind of apology. "I know," she said. "I was one of them. You may not remember me specifically. That is completely reasonable." The last sentence cost her something. She kept her face where she needed it to be. "I have spent 12 years thinking you were probably dead. I searched the personnel files, everything accessible. I couldn't find you. My records were sealed for about 4 years after Tarsus," he said, with the tone of someone who found this more bureaucratically irritating than dramatically significant. "Incident review, long story, mostly boring, involved a lot of forms." He paused. "You searched for me." "Yes, for 12 years. Not continuously," she said, with slightly more dignity than the situation perhaps warranted. "I have a job." Something shifted in his expression then. The stillness broke into something warmer and slightly helpless, and surprised in a way that had no armor over it. He ran one hand through his hair, which did nothing useful to it. "I don't remember your face," he said. "From that night, I should tell you that honestly. I remember the corridor. I remember the door. I remember a lot of that night in pieces that don't always connect the way I'd like them to." He looked at her directly. "I remember getting someone out. I didn't know what happened to you after." "I survived," Velara said, clearly. "Clearly," he agreed, and there was something almost like humor at the edges of it. "I became a diplomat." "That tracks," he said. "You have the—" He gestured vaguely at the general air around her, which she interpreted as a reference to her composure, and chose not to mention that said composure had been performing at well above its rated capacity for the last 2.5 hours. "The bearing, the thing." "The thing," she repeated. "I'm not always great with words," he said. "I mostly work in threat assessments." Her jaw patterns pulsed gold once briefly, before she caught them. He noticed, she saw him notice, saw the flicker of curiosity cross his face as the bioluminescent lines caught the room's light. And he did not ask, which she found she was grateful for and somehow also disappointed by in equal measure. She had approximately 14 questions she wanted to ask him, and no ordered sense of which one deserved to be first. He was real. He was standing in front of her holding a notepad held together by the philosophical concept of stubbornness. And he was real. And he did not remember her face, and she had carried his for 12 years. And none of the versions of this conversation she had rehearsed in the abstract had included the part where he said, "I'm not always great with words." "I wanted to thank you," she said. "That was primarily. I wanted to find you and tell you that I have thought about what you did, and that it mattered, and that I am here in part because of a decision you made in a burning corridor that you probably don't fully remember making." He was quiet for a moment. "You're welcome," he said. And then, because apparently he was that kind of person, "I'm James Ockhaffer, by the way, since you've been looking for a name to go with the corridor." Velara looked at him. 12 years collapsed quietly into the recycled station air between them. "Velara-san," she said, "since you don't have one to go with the face." They ended up in the station's only halfway decent cafe, which was not saying very much. The atmospheric processors in this section had apparently given up on the fresh linen fiction, and were now producing something that smelled honestly of old metal and coffee, which Velara found she preferred. Honesty, even in air filtration, was something she had always respected. She ordered tea. James Ockhaffer ordered coffee, looked at it when it arrived, and then looked at it again with the expression of a man conducting a silent negotiation with his own expectations. "It's bad," he confirmed, to no one in particular. "I did warn you," said the serving unit, which had apparently been programmed with opinions. "You didn't, actually." "I implied it," the serving unit said, and rotated back toward the counter with the quiet dignity of a machine that had made its position clear. Velara watched this exchange and felt something loosen in her chest, not the tension she had been carrying since the briefing room, which was still present and still requiring management, but something older than that. Something that had been wound tight for 12 years around the shape of a memory, and had not known, until this moment, that it was allowed to breathe. She wrapped both hands around her tea and said nothing for a moment, because nothing was what the moment needed, and she had learned, in 12 years of diplomacy, that silence was not the same as emptiness. James turned the coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. He had the quality, she was discovering, of someone who was comfortable in silence too, not uncomfortable comfortable, the performed ease of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but genuinely at rest in the space between words. She had not expected that. She had expected many things from this conversation, had constructed and dismantled versions of it across years, but she had not specifically expected to sit across from him in a bad cafe and feel, of all things, recognized. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The light," he said, and gestured toward his own jaw and collarbone in approximation. "It happened a few times. What does it mean?" Velara considered giving him the diplomatic answer, which was technically accurate and entirely uninformative. She considered the version she gave at cultural exchange briefings, which was accessible and thorough, and revealed nothing of personal substance. Then she looked at him across the table, this man who had her name now, her real name, to go with a face he was only just beginning to learn, and decided that she had spent enough years managing the distance between what was true and what was safe to say. "Gold means something between relief and recognition," she said. "It is not a color we choose. It happens before the thought that causes it has finished forming." He absorbed this with the careful attention of someone storing information correctly. "It happened when you first walked in," he said. "Before I noticed you, I saw it from the back row." Velara went very still. "I didn't know what it was," he said. "I thought maybe a medical thing. I almost asked someone." He paused. "I'm glad I didn't." "That would have been a difficult question to answer in that context," she agreed, with a composure that was doing genuinely impressive work. 12 years, he said, not for the first time, but differently this time, not with the slightly stunned quality of someone processing new arithmetic, but with the weight of someone who had done the arithmetic and understood what it meant. You looked for me for 12 years. I told you I have a job. You looked for me for 12 years and also had a job, he said. I want you to know that I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because I spent a long time after Tarsus not knowing who made it out. The medical team had records, but he stopped. I didn't think I was allowed to look. I thought that wanting to know felt like asking for something. I don't entirely know how to explain that. You don't have to, Velara said. I think I understand the shape of it. Outside the cafe's narrow viewport, Meridian Junction's exterior lights were cycling into their long shift pattern, the slow orange to blue transition that the station used in place of a sun. It was, objectively, a poor substitute. The color it cast through the scratched plexiglass was the color of something trying its best, which Velara found oddly moving, and then immediately found it characteristic of herself to be moved by a station's lighting cycle, rather than addressing the human sitting across from her who had just told her, in the careful language of someone unused to telling anyone anything, that he had wondered too. She had thought once that finding him would close something. That gratitude delivered was debt settled, memory honored, story complete. She had carried that assumption the way she had carried his face, as a fixed thing, a known quantity, a coordinate she could locate herself by. She had not examined whether the assumption was true because the assumption had seemed, for 12 years, entirely theoretical. It was not theoretical now. He was finishing his bad coffee with the resolution of someone who had committed to a decision and intended to see it through, and he was real, and she was sitting across from him, and nothing was closing. Everything was, in the most disorienting and quietly extraordinary way, opening. I have 3 more days on Meridian Junction, she said. The follow-up sessions run through the 16th. I'm here through the 18th, he said. Debrief and secondary assessment review, mostly forms. He looked at her, also mostly boring. I find, Velara said, that boring things are sometimes worth attending to. The serving unit rotated past their table, noted the untouched coffee